Hello, and welcome to Jenna Rereads The Silmarillion. Episode 4, Aulë's Arts and Crafts Project. So, last time we talked about the chapter of the beginning of days, and we officially started the Quenta Silmarillion. Melkor was causing all sorts of problems, destroying things left and right. He has holed up in the north, built himself this big, ridiculous fortress called Autumno, and he's got a bunch of evil Maiar and monsters and stuff up there with him. He attacked the Valar before they were able to do anything about him, and he destroyed the two lamps, which were the original light sources of Arda. And the Valar, instead of dealing with him, basically decided to retreat. They left their original dwelling place in Middle-earth and headed over to the continent of Aman, where they created the land of Valinor, and that's where they are. Yavanna, with some assistance from Jenna, created these two beautiful, shining, sparkly trees that are the new light sources of the world, or, well, actually, of the world isn't quite accurate. Because of the high mountains that the Valar raise around Valinor to keep Melkor out, their light does not reach to Middle-earth. It only really provides light for Valinor and the rest of Aman. So the Valar were kind of two minds about what to do about Melkor. Some of them wanted to go and take Melkor out before the children of Ilúvatar wake up, but others were like, oh no, we can't go get rid of Melkor, because when we fight Melkor, it tends to destroy continents, and we don't know where the children of Ilúvatar are. They were worried about, accidentally killing the children of Ilúvatar. So this idea ended up prevailing, and the Valar decided not to attack Melkor. So he's just kind of running amok in Middle-earth right now, just kind of doing whatever he wants. Now, we're about to find out what Aulë's been doing in this time, instead of attacking Melkor. If you will recall from the Valaquenta, Aulë is kind of the blacksmith god. He is basically the Vala of making stuff. He's associated with the earth and the substances of the earth. Metal, rock, gems, all that stuff. If you're doing the whole, I'm going to pair up the Valar with Greek gods to help keep track of them in my head thing, Aulë is kind of like Hephaestus. So, Aulë is getting kind of impatient. He really wants the children of Ilúvatar to wake up because he's really, really excited about sharing his knowledge with them and teaching them and all that good stuff. So he decides to embark on a little project. He goes over to Middle-earth, doesn't tell any of the other Valar what he's up to, and he creates the dwarves. I said the dwarves are more like the stepchildren of Ilúvatar, and we'll find out why here. He creates the dwarves so that he will have other beings different from himself that he can teach. But he didn't know exactly what the children of Ilúvatar were going to look like. He had sort of a vague idea, so that's how he based the design of the dwarves on. And he made them to be tough. He was worried because Melkor was really powerful, thanks to the Valar not doing anything about him. So he made the dwarves tough so they would be able to endure a world where Melkor was dominant. But, however, Aulë's attempts at sort of keeping this on the down low by going off to Middle-earth and doing it in secret don't really work with Ilúvatar. When you have a omnipotent god that knows everything and sees everything, you're not really going to be able to hide it. So Aulë is teaching the dwarves the special language that he's created for them, which, okay, we're going to go on a little digression here, but if you'll recall from The Lord of the Rings and the appendices and some of the discussion about dwarves, the dwarves don't teach anybody their language. Their language is secret. They won't even speak it around outsiders. We only ever hear a few words and phrases in Dwarvish in any point in the books. Even in The Hobbit, when you have a party consisting of mostly dwarves, except for a hobbit and a wizard, they still aren't speaking their own language. They keep it very private. And you can see why here, that it's like sacred to them, that Aulë himself taught it to them. So I find that very interesting. That there's only like a few outsiders, like there's only a few elves that have ever actually learned the dwarf language, which, says a lot about how the dwarves must have regarded them if they had actually trusted them enough to teach them their language. And another thing that's mentioned, I'm trying to remember exactly where it is. I think it's in the Lord of the Rings appendices in the section on dwarves, where it says that they don't even share their real names with outsiders. Like all of the names that we hear, or most of the names we hear of the dwarves in the books, are just like Elvish or human language versions of their names. That their actual names they don't share with non-dwarves. So yeah, I find that really interesting. So anyway, moving on. So Iluvatar pops in and is like, Aulë, what are you doing? And Aulë's like, nothing, but I wasn't doing anything. I definitely wasn't creating any kind of other beings. Nope, nothing going on here. And Iluvatar's like, Aulë, I can see what you're doing. And he's like, why have you done this? You know that you can't create sentient life. We've been through this before with Melkor. I'm the only one that can create sentient life. I have the flame imperishable, and you don't. So, what exactly were you trying to do with this? He's like, that they're not gonna have lives of their own. They're not really gonna be sentient. That they're only gonna be like, moving around and stuff when you're thinking about them, and when you're not, they're just gonna be standing there idle. And Aulë's like, I don't want to have a bunch of mindless slaves or anything like that. I didn't make them for that reason. He's like, I wanted to create things, and I was just imitating you, like a parent, or like a child would imitate their parents. So here, we can see a bit of a difference between him and Melkor. I'm going to talk about that a bit more at the end, because I think that's kind of a big theme of this chapter. So Aulë, then, feeling kind of ashamed of what he did, takes up his hammer, and he's going to smite the dwarves. And he's all upset, but then the dwarves show that they are not, in fact, mindless, automatons or something, and they cringe when they see the hammer, and they're all afraid, and Iluvatar's like, oh, you actually did create sentient life. He says, dost thou not see that these things have now a life of their own, and speak with their own voices? Else they would not have flinched from thy blow, nor from any command of thy will. And so, because of that, because Iluvatar sees that Aulë really was not like he said, he was not creating these dwarves so he would have like a bunch of mindless slaves. He decides to grant them life and a place in the world. So he says, even as I gave being to the thoughts of the Ainur at the beginning of the world, so now I have taken up thy desire, and given to it a place therein, but in no other way will I amend thy handiwork, and as thou hast made it, so shall it be. So he's going to, give the dwarves lives, or for some reason, I cannot talk today. He's going to give the dwarves life, and he's going to let them dwell in the world with his children. But he's not going to change them. They're going to stay the way that they were when Aulë made them. But he says, but elves first. Elves are the firstborn, so after they wake up, the dwarves will wake up. Not before then. So as you can see, they're kind of the stepchildren of Iluvatar. He basically adopts them. So Aulë takes the 7 fathers of the dwarves, which I guess are like the 7 original dwarves that he made, and lays them to rest under different mountains in Middle-earth. So after the elves wake up, they'll wake up. We learn a few more interesting tidbits about dwarves here. Dwarves live like a lot longer than humans. You may recall from Lord of the Rings that they can live like several centuries, but they're not immortal. They do eventually die, so they're not immortal like elves. Now, we get some elvish ideas about what happens to dwarves when they die. Some elves think that they turn back into stone when they die, which is completely ridiculous. The dwarves themselves apparently believe that they go to a special part of the halls of Mondos, which Aulë had set aside for them. I tend to believe that. As the idea of them just turning into stone is just completely ridiculous. And they have great reverence for Aulë, as you might expect, since he was the one who created them. And they call him Mahal, the Maker. And they believe that they're going to have a part in the remaking of the world at the end. That they're going to help Aulë repair the world after the last battle. So, anyway, there's some information about dwarves. So, Yavanna, who, as you may recall, is Aulë's wife, finds out about this and is like, wow, you're lucky that Iluvatar granted you this favor and wasn't really angry about it. But then she says, well, because you hid all of this from me, then your children are not really going to have much appreciation for mine, i.e. plants and animals. Because dwarves are into the same stuff that Aulë is into: rock and stone and metal and gems and things under the earth, not so much the things that grow on the earth. So, and then Aulë's like, yeah, well, the children of Iluvatar are going to cut down your trees, and they're going to hunt animals, and they're going to eat plants, too, so I don't know what you're going on about the dwarves doing this for. Yavanna gets really troubled because she's really upset at the idea of anybody cutting down her trees and messing with her beautiful plants. And keep in mind that Yavanna's creations have already, taken a hit because, with Melkor basically polluting the land just by his presence, he's killing the plants and the animals or turning some of the animals into monsters, so she's already worried about more of her stuff getting destroyed. So she goes to Manwë, and says that she's really worried about this. And she's like, all my works are dear to me. Is it not enough that Melkor should have marred so many? Shall nothing I have devised be free from the dominion of others? And then Manwë's like, well, what would you like to do then? If you had your will. And then Yavanna says that, with animals, they can at least, defend themselves, or they can run away. But plants can't. They have no defenses. Well, unless they're poison ivy or some kind of prickly thorn bushes or something. But for the most part, they don't have any defenses. So she wants to have some kind of protection for her plants and trees. And Manwë says, I like this line, it's just kind of funny. This is a strange thought. Um, after she's like, would that the trees might speak on behalf of all things that have roots and punish those that wrong them. And she's like, yeah, well, this was in the song. And you were preoccupied with Ulmo, like you guys were hanging out making clouds and stuff. But I lifted up the branches of the great trees to receive them, and some sang to Iluvatar amid the wind and rain. So then Manwë sits and thinks about this for a while. The two of them are kind of hanging out under the two trees. He's like communing with Iluvatar, because the Valar can do that. I don't remember if I mentioned that in a previous episode, but they can. They have contact with him, as we just saw with him and Aulë earlier in this chapter. But anyway, Manwë's communing with him, and so he tells Yavanna that Iluvatar is totally okay with her like tree protector idea, and that they're going to create Ents. Yes, this is the creation of Ents, to be the shepherds of the trees. And the description here is, like, kind of vague. It says, when the children awake, then the thought of Yavanna will awake also, and it will summon spirits from afar, and they will go among the Kelvar and the Olvar. Kelvar and Olvar are plants and animals, by the way. And some will dwell therein and be held in reverence, and their just anger shall be feared. So, I mean, it just sort of describes the Ents as being spirits that are, like, inhabiting trees. Which I have to wonder, like, what kind of spirits? Is it just, like, spirits, like, souls, like, the way that the children of Iluvatar have souls? Or are they, like, Maiar spirits? And I'm not sure that there's really an answer to that. I don't know. I mean, Ents are immortal, as we know from Lord of the Rings, with Treebeard talking about how he was around, like, back in the First Age, and even, like, before that. But they can be killed, so I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure about that, what exactly kind of spirits we're talking here. And we also get a mention of the eagles. Manwë talks about the eagles getting the same kind of spirits put into them, which, you know, is another debate. Like, are the eagles of Manwë, are they Maiar? Or are they just, like, special, like, regular eagles that are sentient? So again, I don't really have an answer. So Yavanna's really happy about this, and she goes back to Aulë and is like, ha! See? Your dwarves had better beware now, because I have got myself some Ents. They're going to be tree protectors, and they're going to kick the ass of anybody who's messing with my trees. And Aulë is like, he's in his workshop, and he just sort of like, just looks over unimpressed, and he says, nonetheless, they will have need of wood. So, yeah, whatever. They're still going to need wood. And then then the chapter ends, and we cut out, and we don't get to see Yavanna's reaction, but I can just imagine what it must have been like. We'll put it this way. Aulë probably had to sleep in his workshop that night. So, anyway, they're an interesting couple, Aulë and Yavanna. I know I talked about before how they're maybe not quite as strange a couple as they might initially appear, in that they both have a connection with Earth, but we still see how they come into conflict in this chapter. You know, the love of the substances of Earth, what it's made of, versus the things living and growing on it. So, yeah, that's fun. They're an interesting couple. So the big thing that's really interesting to discuss with this chapter is the difference between Aulë and Melkor. Back in the Valaquenta, Aulë was described as being the Vala who was the most like Melkor. that they had similar powers and abilities and stuff, and they've both got this thing with wanting to create. So, we got to look at, where does Melkor go wrong, but Aulë doesn't? And I think the big difference is their motivations. They both want to create stuff. They're both sort of wanting to create in imitation of Ilúvatar. But with Melkor basically wants to be Ilúvatar. He's jealous of Ilúvatar. He can't stand it that he himself is a created being, that he's not Ilúvatar. And that's what leads to his downfall. Whereas with Aulë, that's absent. As Aulë says, that he was doing what he did in imitation of Ilúvatar, in the way that, like, a child may imitate their parent. That he wasn't doing it because he wanted to be Ilúvatar or as a form of mockery or anything like that. And that kind of jealousy and those issues that Melkor has are pretty much absent. Aulë does what he does out of a desire to have other created beings with which he can share his knowledge. He's doing it out of a desire to teach. If you'll remember, in the Ainur Lindalade, a lot of the Ainur were really excited about doing that. They wanted to teach the children of Ilúvatar and help them out and stuff. And that's basically Aulë's big motivation here. And another thing is the sentience of the dwarves. That he actually did create sentient life that had thoughts independent from him. When the dwarves see him raising his hammer and they start cowering, it shows that, they're sentient beings. Otherwise, they would have been like, yes, master, whatever you say. And they would have just, stood there and let him kill them, or destroy them. But they didn't. Whereas with Melkor just wants mindless minions. And we'll see that. That's basically what he's got. Mindless minions. This has not come up yet, but is going to. He basically, expends his power, using it to control, all of his minions and basically bend them to his will. In the Ainur Lindalade, we know his reaction to seeing the children of Ilúvatar was, oh, yes, here's a bunch of people I can dominate and bend to my will and, make them my slaves, basically, and have them call me Lord. He basically wants mindless slaves to kind of obey and worship him. So, if it were Melkor doing this, those dwarves would not have flinched from the hammer at all. So that's the difference, really, is their motivations. We will see this with Melkor. I think this is going to come up in the next chapter, if I recall correctly, that Melkor has basically lost the ability to create anything. He just is destroying things that other people create. We saw him destroy the lamps in the last chapter, because he just hates anything that he himself didn't make. And the fact that he's abiding in this world that wasn't his, it wasn't created by him. But Aulë does not have those kinds of feelings of resentment. So Aulë does not fall the way that Melkor falls. So, yeah, I think that's pretty much all you can say about that. But it's an interesting topic, and it's an interesting comparison, because I think, we're deliberately supposed to compare them here. Let's see. Anything else in this chapter? Yeah, well, some of the stuff about nature and the conflict between different peoples and nature is interesting. What Yavanna says, that because Aulë just went behind her back and made the dwarves and she wasn't involved in their creation, that they're not going to appreciate nature very much. And we know from a lot of what we see in the books, they largely don't. They live underground. Sometimes they just stay underground and they never come up from their mountain dwellings. And So that doesn't show much appreciation for nature there, but yet at the same time, we do see some dwarves like Gimli who do develop some of that. So there are exceptions. Um, and there's also the conflict between elves and dwarves, which is kind of foreshadowed here. Iluvatar mentions that there's going to be strife between his children and Aule's. But, and I don't want to get too ahead of myself here, but the big elf dwarf problems aren't really going to set in until we get towards the end of this book. We will see elves and dwarves working together. Even if they're not BFFs, they at least have sort of a cordial relationship. But I don't want to say too much about that because it's going to get kind of spoilery and I don't want to get too far ahead. So anyway, that wraps up this chapter. It's a short chapter, but there's a lot in it. There's a lot to talk about. So next time, we will finally get to the elves. Yes, the elves are going to wake up in the next chapter. And I'm going to warn you right now that a lot of the next one is probably going to be me explaining the different groups of elves and trying to make it less confusing for people. So yeah, elves next time. I'll see you then.